All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jaakko Stenros, a game scholar from the University of Tampere, from Finland. Today I shall talk about how Larp found its way into the permanent exhibition, into a permanent exhibition at the museum. But first, a little history. I've been researching games for over a decade now. When I started, people working in games were still getting the side eye, but when are you going to get an actual job? Question was not unheard of. Games certainly were not considered culturally significant, and talking about, for example, our ludic heritage would have been met with rolling eyes. To be honest, even us scholars were not yet clear about their significance. In 2012, Tampere hosted the Nordic Digra conference on game research. This meant that a number of international scholars were coming into town. We wanted to offer them somehow a peek into the Finnish game scene. Spearheaded by researcher Anna-Kaisa Kultima, the idea was hatched to put together an exhibition on Finnish games. Displays of local digital games are common at game conferences. However, unlike most game study units around the world, University of Tampere Game Research Lab has always been interested not just in digital games, but games in general. One of our strengths as a unit has always been our inclusive take on games. We've looked at everything from scratch cards to board games, from solitaire to sports, and from digital games to Larp. Thus, the exhibition naturally showed games that are digital and games that are non-digital. In the process of putting together this exhibition, together with the staff of Rubriikki, the Media Museum of Tampere, older pieces we knew next to nothing about started to surface from their collection, such as a game about the Finnish Civil War in 1918, published in 1918. We realized that we do not fully know and appreciate our ludic heritage. This is the Civil War game. This exhibition was put together by a tight, devoted team, but it was open for just 1 week because that was the amount of time that they had an opening at the museum. Yet it triggered questions we did not know the answers to, and it hinted at a treasure just out of reach. The dream of a permanent game museum was born. Now, there are museums and gallery exhibitions of games and plays scattered around the globe. They are not common, but they do exist. However, in Finland, the closest thing we had at the time were toy museums. Over the years, the museum dream started to turn into a plan. The Tampere-based museum complex Rubriikki started to push for a Finnish museum of games, partnered with the University of Tampere and Pelikone Peijonit, an association devoted to collecting and maintaining digital games and the game machines that are used to run them. 2 years ago, the project moved forward with the help of crowdfunding. The crowdfunding turned out to be a resounding success. Turns out that there's quite a lot of people who felt that having a game museum, having our ludic heritage somehow put on display is a worthwhile effort. The crowdfunding was able to raise over 80,000 euros, which is quite a lot of money for a museum that is starting. Of course, the booming Finnish digital game industry didn't hurt the initiative either. However, once you start trying to put together a museum of games, you run into quite a number of interesting questions. What should be included? Whose history should be told? What games should be included? Because inclusions and exclusions would end up creating a canon, whether you want it or not. Is this museum told from the point of view of players? Is it told from the point of view of the game industry? Do we choose games based on what are popular or games that are educational? I mean, what is the criteria for inclusion? Another question was, how should the games be displayed? Most toy museums in Finland have toys in glass cabinets. But is the object really a toy if you can't play with it? The same applies to games. If you are looking at them through a glass, what do you actually see? It was decided that the museum, the story of the museum, would be told through 100 Finnish games. Selecting the games, curating the exhibition was a grueling process. Here we have a screenshot from the Google Docs place where these things were kept track of. In the end, we ended up with an exhibition that has a very wide spectrum. The only games left out of the museum were sports, because sport museums do exist already. This is when I personally became first involved in the process. I was consulted on the selection of the role-playing games that were to be included. One problem was that since no one had been responsible for preserving Finnish ludic heritage, there was no collection to draw games from. I mean, there are a few items here and there in the museum collections, but there is no collection of role-playing games. Indeed, we didn't even have a list of all the Finnish role-playing games products that had been published at the time. When we realized this, I became deeply envious of the Norwegian archive of Larps. In Norway, there's a system for preserving the written part of Larps for posterity. In Finland, we have nothing of the sort. However, the reason that there is such an infrastructure in Norway is basically that someone decided to build it. Someone needs to be that person. I decided to do the same in Finland for tabletop role-playing games, at least in the beginning. Through friends, conventions, and social media, I have been able to put together not only a list of pretty much all the published Finnish tabletop role-playing products, which is 240 something, but I've been also able to gather 80% of those products for the collection at the museum. Of course, we can't put 240 games on display. We needed to make some choices. Out of the 100 games that were chosen, 8 are tabletop role-playing games. There is the very first Finnish tabletop role-playing game called Miekka ja Magia. There is the role-playing game that was sold most widely, including on gas stations, called Ankh, Adventurers of the North Kalevala Heroes. It's interesting, the name is in English, the acronym is Ankh, which is sort of goes to Egypt, and it's a Kalevala game, and it's in Finnish, so I don't know what was going on there. It's included. Astra Terra was there representing the new wave of children's tabletop games. Bliaron was a game that was chosen because we had access to the wonderful design material of the designers. They made a huge contribution to the museum. Then there's Lamentations of the Flame Princess, fairly recent role-playing game going back to the rules of role-playing that is published by an American living in Finland. Tähti, which is a tabletop game about playing a girl band in near future. Kuninkaan Aika, the first tabletop game that had a female designer and which is about sort of a religious take on role-playing, and Praedor, the most popular fantasy role-playing game in Finland. In addition to these 8 tabletop games, there's also Mordheim, which is a miniature war game. It's actually a British game published by Games Workshop, but we expanded the idea of what is a Finnish game here a little bit, because the main designer, the lead designer is a Finn. There is also a peculiarity called Lohikäärmepuu, the dragon tree, which was a call-in radio show that ran in Finland in the 1990s, where the listeners would call in and 2 people would act as game masters on radio, and they would run a role-playing game for that person for the benefit of the listeners. The setup for the Lohikäärmepuu is also recreated in the museum. Then there are 2 LARPs that are included in the 100 games. One represents the domestic LARP culture, the other brings in the Nordic scene. The first one is Rajakatse, a fantasy LARP that has been running since 1995. The second is Halat Hisar, the Palestinian-Finnish LARP about occupied Finland. Here, I love the fact that when artsy Nordic Larp is finally put on show in a museum. The display includes a buffer rock. In the museum, there is a focus on playing. Over 60 of the games that are on display are playable. Unfortunately, the role-playing games are not included in that number. In addition to the 100 Finnish games, there is an arcade of classic games and rooms built to reflect certain moments in time, like the demo scene room from the 1990s and a girl's bedroom from the late 80s. There are internationally known big games like Snake on Nokia phones, Angry Birds, Max Payne and Clash of Clans, but also obscure works like orienteering simulations, one of the oldest text adventure games based on Lord of the Rings, made in 1980, called Lord, which hasn't been playable in 30 years, but they found the tape where a backup copy existed, and now it is playable in the museum. It's very hard because it's text-based, and you have to understand that it's used in sort of Finnish version of English. So the syntax is a little bit challenging. One key aspect of running an interactive museum like this is maintenance. Taking care of the physical machines, troubleshooting problems, bringing games back to the starting position, all of this requires work. Because in order for these to be actually playable, there's needed to be people there taking care of these constantly. Otherwise, half of them would be out of work all the time. Also, it's not enough to have the tools of play present. They need to be easy to approach and start, and there needs to be clear instructions how to use that equipment for play as well. The first temporary exhibition at the museum is Minun pelihistoriani, My Gaming History. This is a small exhibition I curated with Anna-Kaisa Kultimo. It showcases game, play and toy histories of 13 people. Through artifacts and personal reflections, the private is made public. In addition, 13 players were present at the museum in shifts. They would explain the exhibition and be open to talking about play histories. Mostly, however, they acted as co-players. Indeed, a museum of games and play needs not only playable games, but people to play them with. When putting together the exhibition, we realized that play is pervasive in our lives. Telling one's play history is a way of telling one's history. The games that have shaped us, limitations of playing, the toys our friends outgrew before us, the sounds of our childhood play objects, and the objects we use today, games and play leave their mark on us. Even the times when we did not play, perhaps because it was uncool, shape us as well. Also, I'm fairly certain that this is the only time ever that the Danish prison camp Larp Capo has been juxtapositioned with a toy horse, as you see here, at least in a museum context. The museum opened in early January this year. It has already proven to be quite successful, attracting over 10,000 visitors during the first month. This includes people of all ages, including many in the late 20s, early 30s, a demographic that usually are not big museum goers. Unlike other game museums, it includes both digital and non-digital games. Unlike most game museums, it is not run by hobbyist collectors, but by museum professionals who understand the importance of preservation, contextual information, historical research, and want to look at games and not just their favorite games. Unlike most historical takes on games, the Finnish Museum of Games does not tell the tale of American and Japanese digital games, but proudly concentrates on local cultural heritage. However, the most exciting thing about the Finnish Museum of Games is that it is a permanent museum that has just started. Already in the process of putting together the permanent exhibition, we've learned so much about early Finnish board games, the handmade miniature war games of the 1950s, the anonymous indie games of the 80s, early demo scene. But yet, perhaps even more importantly, we have learned about the huge gaps in our knowledge. We've learned that there's so much we don't know about our ludic heritage. We have no idea what happened in board games 60, 70 years ago. There's a big gap in our knowledge. And we've also learned about the specific challenges of preserving play. The work is just getting started. One of the big projects on the horizon is a big exhibition on Finnish tabletop role-playing game culture coming in the fall of 2018. After that is done, we'll probably start working on a long overdue exhibition on Larp. Before that, however, we need to work out how to display Larp in a way that is playable, understandable, and sustainable in a museum context. This is a challenge I look forward to wrestling with. Thank you.